Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for being here in person, those of you who have the pleasure of being in Perugia in Italy, and welcome everybody who is watching this panel online. We're at the end of what's been a remarkable festival. We are, however, going to be delving into some difficult content, some difficult discussions, but please stay with us. So my name is Julie Posetti. I'm Global Director of Research at the International Center for Journalists. I'm a journalist and I'm also an academic. For the past 2.5 years, I've been leading a variety of projects focused on gender-based online violence. And those projects have been in partnership with the University of Sheffield, UNESCO, and also the UK Foreign Office. And I'm going to talk to you just for a moment about the work that we've been doing and what we've determined so far before we get into a conversation with the extraordinary panel of women journalists we have here today. So before I give you an overview of our research and what it indicates about the very urgent need to respond in more effective ways to gender-based online violence against journalists, I would like the panelists to actually introduce themselves. So I might start to my right with Patricia. Do you want to just introduce yourself and tell us where you're from?
Oh, sure. My name is Patricia Campos Mello. I'm a reporter from Brazil.
Excellent, thank you.
My name is Rana Ayyub. I'm a journalist and a global opinions writer with the Washington Post. Good to see you all here.
And we have on the screen behind me, although I can't see you, Marianna Spring, I imagine you're there you are, above us here on a huge screen. I don't want to intimidate you, but you are on an enormous screen. And I've just said your name, but you can also say your name and tell us where you're from.
Thanks, Julie. I'm Marianna Spring. I'm the BBC's specialist disinformation and social media reporter. And I'm sorry I can't be there in wonderful Perugia with all of you, but I'm really happy that Rana is able to be there. That's really good news.
Indeed. So Marianna was supposed to be here with us, but she fell ill. So she's nevertheless gracing us with her presence on the Zoom, which is excellent. And sitting to my far left, sorry, Di, if you want to actually grab the microphone. This is my colleague from the University of Sheffield.
Yes, so I'm Dr. Dianna Maynard, as Julie said, from the University of Sheffield. So I'm a computer scientist who's been helping Julie with the analysis.
Yep. So I brought Di up because she's going to ride some cool tools for us at the end of our discussion. So let me give you an overview of the work that we've been doing over this past couple of years, which involves all of these women sitting here and Marianna on the big screen. So at the end of 2019, UNESCO commissioned a global study into gender-based online violence against women journalists. And that study was looking at 15 countries. You can read about which countries and why in this extract from the larger study. This is called The Chilling Global Trends in Online Violence Against Women Journalists. It was published last May. We've got just a few hard copies here, but it's available free online, and we hope the big version of this study, the full study, will be published on World Press Freedom Day, May 3 this year. So this study looked in detail at 15 countries in terms of the experience of women journalists in those countries and the types and manifestations and impacts of online violence in those environments. We also interviewed around 182, I think at last count, journalists and experts from around the world, drawing largely from those 15 country case studies, rather. And additionally, we conducted a survey, a global survey in 2020, focused on 5 language groups. So we surveyed in French, Portuguese, Spanish, English, and Arabic. And we had 900 women journalists responding to that survey. Now, that survey, it revealed some really terrifying on the one hand, not necessarily surprising on the other, statistics for those of us who've lived through the past 5 or 6 years where this problem has escalated very significantly. Just some top-line figures. 73% of the women journalists we surveyed said they'd experienced online violence in the course of their work. And by online violence, we offer the definition of a range of different threats, from digital security attacks, from orchestrated disinformation attacks that leverage misogynistic hate speech, for example. We look at death and rape threats, and we also are focused on some of the digital security threats that expose women journalists to increased risk, which include surveillance and interception and doxing, for example. But we use the term online violence to really explicitly make the point that these acts of abuse, harassment, and attacks form an experience of violence not dissimilar to the kinds of elements of domestic violence that we understand now to be part of a broader picture, which include economic violence, which includes psychological violence. Digital violence is real. There's nothing virtual about it. It has very, very significant psychological impacts. And another statistic from that study that is really disturbing is that 20% of the women journalists who responded from around the world said they'd experienced offline attacks or abuse or harassment that they believed had either been triggered or were linked to the online violence that they'd experienced. So we're starting to see evidence of correlation, if not causation, between online attacks and offline harm. And it was in the context of those kinds of statistics and then the conclusions that we were able to draw from two big data case studies, we're calling them, focused on Maria Ressa, our Nobel Prize winning journalist and heroine, really, in the context of women journalists' struggles around the world, and Carol Cadwallader, who's based in the UK as an investigative journalist, who I like to say blew the lid off Cambridge Analytica, and as a result was subjected to, and continues to be subjected to, very serious online abuse over a sustained period of time. So between those two women, we examined around 2 million posts, and Di, who's sitting to my left from the University of Sheffield's Computer Science Department with other colleagues, examined those posts directed at Maria and Carol across Facebook and Twitter. And we were able to see through an analysis of that large data set, and also in combination with the work that my team did at ICFJ, deep dive interviews in combination with development of timelines to be able to track when incidents occurred offline and whether we're correlating those incidents with online data spikes when it comes to the abuse that those women were experiencing on social media. And we were able, through a synthesis of that research, so the qualitative on the one hand and the technical on the other, to understand much more about the methods, the tropes, so the kinds of abuse that is being used and the patterns of that abuse, and through network analysis to understand more also about the way these attacks are coordinated and the speed with which they often come. So from there, we made a recommendation as the sort of first preliminary recommendations from this report that it was time to consider online violence as an element of risk that deserved an early warning system, so that we could understand what's happening online as a potential trigger for escalation offline to threats that include everything from stalking and coordinated state-linked legal harassment through to rape and murder with impunity at the horrible end of the spectrum. And so the UK Foreign Office came to us and asked if they could support work to further develop this idea of an early warning system. For the past 8 months or so now, we've been working deeply on that, and in addition to the case studies we've produced based on Maria Ressa and Carol Cadwallader, this big data case study methodology, which is quite novel, we have added additional case studies through that project. Rana Ayyub, who is known to very many of you as a result of this festival, if not before, is one of the women we're studying in detail in India. We're also looking at the extraordinary case of Rana Ayyub, who is Al Jazeera's principal presenter, based in Qatar, who comes from Lebanon. We're looking at the case of Daphne Caruana Galizia retrospectively, analysing data sets connected to her and with the flow-on effects to other women journalists being harassed in her name and threatened in the context of her murder, which is a pretty horrific trend. We're also looking at Carmen Aristegui, who is a very prominent journalist in Mexico, and her experiences are horrific. And South Africa is another context we're looking at. We're studying a couple of journalists in the Daily Maverick newsroom, and we're applying this methodology to try to understand the way these trends manifest in various countries around the world to at least be able to determine at a global level what we could consider to be baseline understanding of how these attacks are working and how they are connected to state actors and other nefarious actors, such as organised crime, for example. So the point of all this work is ultimately to try to monitor and predict and ultimately, hopefully, somehow prevent the escalation of online violence into horrific offline incidents. And so we have these women here today to talk about their experiences, both in terms of the online violence and the offline manifestations. And I think at this point I'll move to you, Rana, as somebody who is considered to be, as is Patricia, in fact, one of the emblematic cases internationally when it comes to online violence against women journalists. And so can you talk to us, Rana, about your experience, the trajectory of attacks against you, which is a very long history, unfortunately, and with real respect for how difficult this is, if you could just, for the sake of bringing people up to date, explain, when this began and how it's progressed.
Good evening, everyone. Since yesterday, since I gave my keynote speech and I've been going around, every time I run into somebody, and there has been a constant reaction, and they're all saying, I retweeted you, and I've been given the most choicest of abuses by a lot of trolls in India, and this is just a sample size. Well, that's my life on a daily basis. This is what I live with. Whatever you have been getting after retweeting me, I get that 100 max. Today, after my keynote speech yesterday, I'm the #1 trend in India. I'm the top trend. And there are, so far, right now, as we talk, there are 22,000 tweets generated against me, and of course, a lot of them for me in the last 24 hours. Because I spoke up yesterday about the judge of a court giving me permission to fly for this festival, I just tweeted something that said, one of the Twitter trolls, they're not even Twitter trolls. These are people who have massive following, call themselves nationalists. Somebody with a 14,000 Twitter following said, did you sleep with the judge the night before the judgment was given? And this is something that is being shared widely. Over the last 3 weeks, I have flagged on Twitter people from the right wing with a sword in their hand saying, wherever you are, coming to separate your neck from the body. And I've posted this on Twitter. Another one says, coming to gang rape you and your family. Posting this on Twitter, tagging Twitter officials. I don't know if any one of them are here, but I know that there won't be an end to our agony. This is possibly the life they are giving us in response to the journalism that we do and our opinions, and that's how unsafe it is. And this is not something which is new to me. The Wire, which is an independent publication in India, published an investigation titled Tech Fog, where the observations were that India's ruling party used a software called Tech Fog to attack women journalists, and among the 10 top journalists, I topped #1 on the most abused journalists in India. And even today, if you look at the Twitter trend, and you see the kind of abuses.
Can we just bring the screen up, please?
Yeah. Yesterday, for instance, it's so ironical. Julie and I spoke something about how misinformation spreads, right? And I spoke about how the judge made an observation of a certain amount. And that today has become a Twitter trend. They're tagging Julie and me, saying an international fraud, and for a gullible English white audience, me, a brown woman who's going in. I mean, this is everyday life. This is what we have been facing. When my image is not being morphed on a porn video and shared all over the country, then we are made to face the most abusive language, which is restricted for women, especially if you're a woman with an opinion and you also happen to be a minority amongst minorities, a Muslim woman with a voice. And that seems to be my crime right now.
Yeah, and I mean, I can testify to just how horrific it is as an experience to be even raising your voice in solidarity with Rana Ayyub. So for the first time ever since I joined Twitter in 2007, about 3 weeks ago, I had to take the steps that I said I would never take because I find it offensive that I have to control, at my end, what's thrown at me in terms of abuse, this sort of victim-blaming mentality that the platforms have created, making us as primary targets, women journalists, the first responders to online violence. But I had to limit who can reply to me, to those people that I'm following, and I had to mute all notifications from people that I'm not following. So, and this was simply a way to be able to functionally use Twitter without being drowned in abuse that was directed primarily at Rana, but which also embroiled me. And that, and not just me, but everybody who raised their voice then sort of experienced just what it was like, just a fraction of what it is like for Rana. And when Di comes to show you the dashboard we've been developing in reference to Rana's case, she'll highlight just how rapid fire the responses are. I think it's between 1 and 2 seconds, right, Di, that we start to see violently abusive, blatantly abusive, seriously abusive tweets and threats in reply to Rana every single time she opens her mouth on the platform. And this has been going on, I think, Rana, for about a decade, right? Even
Almost more than a decade, I think. Yeah, it's now a part of my life where I'm asked to kind of live with it. And the moment you speak about it, we are told, stop being a victim. Yeah. So sometimes they literally shame you into not talking about your experience, which I've been witnessing since yesterday when I gave my keynote, and a lot of well-meaning people are saying that, the last thing you should do is victimhood on an international platform. So damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you don't speak up against the misinformation spread against you, they say, oh, she's not speaking up, which means she has something to hide. When you speak up, oh, she's playing the victim mode. So yeah, this is how life is.
Yeah, and the first experiences you had of online violence came directly in response to your reporting, your anti-corruption investigative reporting, didn't they?
Yes, this has been happening more so since 2010 in a more offensive form when I started doing investigations on the extrajudicial murder of Muslims in the state of Gujarat, where Mr. Amit Shah, who's now the Home Minister of the country, was Home Minister of the state, and about his involvement in the extrajudicial murder of many, including alleged involvement, as the court would want us to say, of a young Muslim girl who was killed, who was labeled a terrorist, and her body was put in front of journalists during a press conference labeling her a terrorist, while she had a college badge around her neck. So when I broke the story, that's the first time I kind of witnessed the worst kind of harassment, where I was accused of being a terrorist sympathizer by virtue of being a Muslim, by virtue of just speaking up for the minorities. I have been accused, there was a time when I had to write a post in my magazine Tehelka when I'd hashtag Rana Ayyub sex CD surfaced on Twitter with at least 30 to 40,000 tweets insinuating that there is a sex CD of mine, a tape that exists, who everybody seems to insinuate, but clearly nobody had seen. It only stopped when I tweeted at some point, where is the CD even I would like to see with me and my family. That has happened. Somebody who has been my critic wrote a Facebook post without naming me, calling me somebody who slept with CBI officials to get her story. And that was shared by, it's not the right wing who share it and that matters to you. It's the well-meaning people, especially when it comes to a woman. Men can do whatever they want to, but even if there is an aspersion or a suspicion about a woman journalist, the way it snowballs, and the way it snowballed in my case, I don't even know how to deal with it anymore. In fact, I called Julie this morning and I said, it's been overwhelming, and I have just spent all my day cooped up in my room for the simple reason that it's not a good thing to see your Twitter notifications just overwhelmed with hate and misinformation against you and dragging your family members in a very sexualized way, in a very misogynistic way, in a way to insinuate constantly that you are a loose woman, a promiscuous woman, and a lie when it's repeated 1,000 times, it becomes a fact, and that's what's happening with most of us who are speaking truth to power.
And that's something Maria Ressa says over and over again, and it's been established in her case. There are so many parallels, as I said, I think yesterday in the conversation with you, Rana, between Maria's case and yours. Just to pick up on something that Rana says that we see almost perpetually when it comes to women journalists being abused, and that is the extremely seriously misogynistic nature of abuse. I mean, overwhelmingly misogynistic is the first point. And the term prostitute is used very frequently particularly in global south contexts where there is perceived to be a conservative society in the background where such accusations of a woman journalist being a prostitute and the concept of corrupt journalism that implies. The term prostitute is used, was first seeded in India. It's been used against Maria Ressa. I think it's been used against you, Patricia, from memory. So this dehumanizing, shaming that goes on is very significant. As part of this research, in Rana's case, we also wanted to highlight the ways in which intersectional experiences worsen the impact and the incidence of online violence experienced by women journalists. So in Rana's case, she's a Muslim, from a minority religious community in India, and we thought that one way to try and understand how that manifests would be to actually look at the hashtag prostitute used in reference to Rana. And what we found, and we've published this data already a couple of months ago, this particular data point, we found that 29% of the abuse that Rana experiences in the context of the hashtag prostitute is also Islamophobic. It reflects religious bigotry and sectarianism. And so that's a very clear example of how misogyny, racism and religious bigotry intersect. So Rana, I'm going to give you some breathing space now, and if our colleagues at the back on the tech desk could return Marianna Spring to the screen, that would be grand. But first, Patricia, can I ask you also to please outline your experiences, which began, I think, in a significant way after the election of President Bolsonaro, when you attempted to investigate disinformation connected to his election, and we see so many intersections with disinformation here.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm very sorry, Rana, for everything. Yeah, I mean, I've been a reporter for decades, and I used to cover migration and refugees, so I had been reporting in several complicated places such as Syria and Libya and Sierra Leone during the Ebola crisis. And I always thought that being a woman was really an advantage because we get to speak to half the world's population. We get to know their houses, their families, and this is very difficult for male journalists, right? So every time people said, well, it's difficult, you have a family, how do you do this? And I'm thinking, I'm very fortunate to be a woman, right? So then when I was back home, Brazil, democratic country, elections, and I had been investigating disinformation campaigns in the US, because I was based in the US many years. I covered elections in India, and then I did this in Brazil. So when I first started publishing stories that revealed the use of WhatsApp mass messaging to disseminate disinformation, I started getting these attacks that had never happened to me, but things like they were spreading all my public events in WhatsApp groups, Bolsonaro support WhatsApp groups, telling people to go there and confront me in person. So I had people yelling at me in the streets saying, you know, you're a communist whore. So then I started getting calls, my phone, people saying, I'm going to beat you up, you're a communist, blah, blah. And finally, they threatened my son, who was 6 at the time. So I had to get like a security person for a time, which it's just crazy. I mean, for journalists, right? Like I'm home just covering elections. So then I kept on investigating disinformation and all that. I mean, I said the one thing I can't stop doing is reporting. I'm a reporter, this is what I do, and we get, you know, a lot of reporting here, and this is a lot, they're manipulating people with this disinformation campaigns. So then in 2020, one of the sources of one of the stories insinuated that I tried to seduce him to get information. And when that happened, I never, like online, I just went online and I showed everything, like all the recordings was on the record, all the email exchanges, WhatsApp, you know, showing there was nothing to it. But 5 minutes after he said that, the son of the Brazilian president, who's a legislator, went in the Congress floor and said live that, yeah, that journalist, she offered sex in exchange for information. And then he went online and he did a video doing this, and several other legislators did this. And then finally, a few days later, the president of Brazil went on live TV and made a joke, a pun, saying that I would offer anal sex in exchange for damaging information against him. Well, after he said that, I cannot tell you the stuff I get. It's, you know, it's just, it's like a green light for people. So there's porn videos with my face on it. There's rape threats. There's memes, like all sorts of porn stuff. And every time I'm a reporter, you know, this is what I do. I'm still doing reporting, but everything I do, I get these messages and these memes, and, you know, every time someone posts something. And
we'll come in a minute to what you did in response, which was a very brave, I don't want to use that word loosely, but brave decision to actually take legal action against the instigators of this violence. But one of your points, I know in other conversations, is to highlight how this online violence radiates to affect family members. I mean, we found this in most of the cases we've looked at around the world, that it starts to impact on, you know, children, elderly parents, brothers and sisters, as well as colleagues and sources. And I think that's something that you've also certainly experienced, Patricia.
Yes, I mean, all of you might have lived, all women, unfortunately, we live this every day online, right? It's just like, and I always say it's fine if you say, you know, your reporting sucks, or it's bad, it's wrong, we're going to correct it. But it's never that. It's always like sexual or about appearance, and it's always about our families. And the fact that, for instance, I feel like I have an expression like, do you know when you dream that you're in a crowd and you realize you're naked and everybody's looking at you, and you're like, you don't want to leave your home ever, right? Can you imagine that every time I think my son is going to see this shit? You know, it's online. And that could be said to anyone, my dad, my mom. There's no way this is going to go away.
And some of the experiences of other women we've included in the study that we've done. Among them are Keelan Gallagher, who's sitting here, her clients, Keelan being a an internationally respected human rights lawyer who represents Maria Ressa among other targets of this kind of vile abuse, and over 100 BBC Persia journalists are among them. And in our research for this UNESCO study, we learned that not only were the women being threatened with the most vile, disgusting, sexual violence, but their children were being sent printed images taken from internet memes and other threats via the mail sent to their school in London. I mean, so this is another example. And we have Patricia Devlin, who also at one point was going to be able to join us, a Northern Ireland journalist who she's also fallen unwell this week, unfortunately. And she had the most horrific experience of having repeated messages sent to her, credible threats against her infant child, that this little girl would be raped at a specific address at a specific time, which was her grandmother's address. So, these are really, they're shocking. They're shocking examples, and we have to keep talking about them, even as we work to more practically respond and effectively respond to this crisis, because until it's understood how severe this is and what the lived experience looks like, and you can see it here, we are not going to motivate people to invest or to change their policies from the platforms to the political actors that perpetrate this, from the platforms that are the vectors. Marianna, speaking of platforms, I'd like to come to you now in London. You're the disinformation, specialist disinformation reporter at the BBC, and I'd just like you, if you don't mind, to outline for us what your experiences have been, and which I know from working closely with you over the past year and a half have really escalated badly in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and the myth-busting and debunking that you've tried to do in that regard.
Thank you so much, Julie. And again, I'm so sorry, both Patricia and Rana, to hear about the experiences you've had. And exactly that. So for me, I report on the real consequences of online disinformation and conspiracies around the pandemic. That's involved investigating conspiracy movements online, the anti-vax movement here in the UK and beyond, also around the US election, now around the war in Ukraine. And I found myself, as a consequence, targeted repeatedly with hate and abuse, and particularly that is very, very gendered. Rape threats, death threats, people telling me that they're going to come to my house and they're going to rape me and my mum, people telling me that they're going to get me when I leave the office or when I go outside of work, even people leaving kind of messages on my way into work, so that I don't feel safe anymore, being able to just do your daily commute or walk around. And I just began to notice how very gendered that hate was. Everything from silly little girl, you're too young, you don't know anything, to whore of Satan, you are every possible horrible word you can think of, gendered slur under the sun. And obviously, the hate I get is mainly focused on my gender and age. Unlike other colleagues or people I've interviewed, I'm fortunate in that I don't experience racist hate or religious hate, discrimination because of my sexual orientation, all of those kinds of things. But I decided to actually investigate this topic for Panorama, the online hate I was experiencing, particularly with regards to what the social media sites, the role they play, the role the police play, the role policymakers play. And for that investigation, I spoke to Julie. I cried on BBC One to Julie, just talking about the experience of it and just how tiring it can be to, I absolutely love doing my job, and the most important part of it is talking to real people and being able to expose what's happening and the real consequences that online disinformation, that trolling, that hate have. But constantly having to think about your safety, constantly having to talk to your family and friends and make sure you're okay, constantly having to deal with this, and just as has been highlighted on this panel, but every single time I log on to my social media platforms, I'm greeted with hate, and unfortunately it's become so normal to me that I just expect to be called a whore or a slut or a slag about 10 times a day. And anytime I appear on anything, from, TV to radio to online. I know there'll be a kind of another wave of this stuff, specifically from often the kind of conspiracy movement, but more generally too. And for me, one of the ways of coping with it, I guess, which I've found really positive, has been doing things like the investigation I did for Panorama and the ability to expose what's going on, and the roles that to hold accountable, social media sites and the police, who I've had a very bad experience with here in the UK, and policymakers to be able to better understand that. And, as part of that investigation, I interviewed a range of women, from Julia Gillard, to the former Australian Prime Minister, to Kaz, who is a woman who appeared on Love Island in the UK, which some of you may or may not have watched. And there are just striking similarities between everybody's experience, but also the very specific hate they're targeted with. And all of them had just had enough, and they wanted to be able to talk about it and to feel like, we don't just have to, as Rana kind of mentioned, not, oh no, if you talk about it, you're going to make it so much worse. Being able to actually investigate it and expose the extent of the problem, I think for me has felt quite cathartic, if that's the right word.
And the objective is, of course, to shut down the critical reporting, to silence women. And so I think, it is really, really important to be able to keep speaking, but we have to figure out ways to support that. I'm going to go back through our guests here in reverse. So I'm going to come back to Marianna now on the screen and ask you to pick up on that point, Marianna, connected to the police inaction, perhaps obfuscation, which is also in parallel with the platforms. And to point out something that Marianna didn't mention, you've also experienced that connection between online violence and offline incidents, which are quite chilling. And in fact, we referenced this, I think, in the extract of the chilling. But you had an experience, if I recall correctly, Marianna, where coming out of work, you went to the tube station, the underground that you normally use to commute, and you found a message on a notice board that was directed at you. Can you just remind us of the detail of that? And I'm asking you this specifically because still too many people think that these kinds of experiences happen in the global south or in fragile democracies, that women in Western liberal democracies are not necessarily experiencing this kind of online violence. So Marianna, can you just remind us of those details first, and then tell us what you did in reference to the threats that you've experienced with the police and how that turned out?
Yeah, so the incident with the message left on board, and actually there have been a few of those incidents now, was particularly unnerving because I was on my way, I was actually on my way to work, and there's a notice board at the tube where I normally get off, and it said a comment about me, about my reporting, that this, we know where you are, and that just felt really frightening, because all of a sudden I thought, oh wow, okay, my routine of getting the tube to work and all of the things I usually do, can I do those anymore? And I'm really fortunate that I had very good support from the BBC, who immediately kind of sprung into action. And I've had everything from security people walking my route home with me and thinking about where do I need to pop into if I feel frightened or I'm worried about something, to changing where I walk and how I walk and when I walk and everything like that. But all of those things, it makes you really frustrated, because you think, why do I have to change how I behave and what I do in order to protect myself? And the people who are doing this are allowed to just continue sending hate in that way or escalating it offline. And since then, there are rallies I've covered where I'll be reporting on an anti-vax rally, and I look up and there's a poster that says, Marianna Spring is 25, or Marianna Spring is a slag, and I'm standing right there, and we're obviously with security teams and people we work with, and you have to sort of dash off into a side road, and it's just incredibly. It's really unnerving, because absolutely I've seen that kind of link between the hate I'm receiving online and then how it comes offline, and how it can then frustratingly get in the way of me doing my job, because I want to report on these rallies and I want to understand how it works. With regards to the police, I've this time last year, actually, I escalated a series of kind of very serious, particularly rape threats and death threats sent to me, only the most extreme stuff, which in the greater scheme of things, there's loads of other stuff, but I felt like if I reported all of it, nothing would happen. And I escalated the most extreme stuff. I've been repeatedly passed between liaison officers where people lost portfolios of evidence that I sent to them, where I felt like my fears about the offline violence linked to the online hate weren't taken seriously. I looked into accounts that had been sending me this hate, one of whom appeared to be someone who was released on bail for having stalked and harassed. He'd previously been arrested and put in prison for stalking and harassing a female police officer. And yet, despite this kind of seeming history of form in doing this, the police didn't do anything. I've since kind of been assigned a different liaison officer, and there does appear to have been, since I did the Panorama investigation where I spoke about this.
I mean, to tell the audience, though, you actually exposed the incompetence of the first assigned officers who'd done absolutely nothing to respond to your request. And am I remembering correctly that they also asked you to essentially provide the information all over again, so you had to retrawl through the abuse because they'd somehow been unable to relocate it?
Yeah, so I re-pulled together all the abuse. They asked me to label all of the hate I sent, which I'd done the first time anyways, but they asked me to do it again because the officer, to quote, said he didn't know how to use Instagram and Twitter, so he wasn't sure how to handle the portfolio I'd sent him. And I spoke about this in the Panorama, and in response to that, the police told us that they do take online hate seriously. I have to say, from my experience, it hasn't felt like that. As I think I said at the time to you, Julie, if that's the experience of me, a reporter who actually for a living investigates online hate and disinformation, how on earth is it for all of the other women who got in touch with me afterwards to say, I'm getting death threats and rape threats and nobody cares? I don't know what to do about it.
Patricia, can I come to you now? Because you've described the experiences you had. Two of the biggest instigators and amplifiers were, in fact, the president and his son, and you took legal action, which everybody in this space was watching incredibly closely. Very important case. Can you describe what motivated you to do that and what happened? How effective was that as a response?
Well, as Marianna was saying, this is such a terrific job, and I just feel that why do we have to stop doing what we do, right? And this is the first advice I got when this all started, 5 years ago. It was like, oh, you should start reporting about something else. I'm like, no, I'm uncovering stuff, They're just changing legislation. This is good. I'm not going to stop because they're harassing me. So this is the one thing I did. It's like I kept on doing exactly what I was doing. I kept on investigating. And I thought this was very important because if I changed, right? And then the second thing, when I saw that there was a very distinct source of the attacks, the president, his son, it got to a point that he wouldn't stop. They were using this as smokescreen, right? Like every other day he would raise something and tag me, and and every time he tags me or any journalist, several women journalists in Brazil go through this. It just unleashes like a torrent of hate. So I got to the decision that if I didn't sue him, he would not stop. So I sued the president, which, I had never sued anyone. It's just, we're journalists, we don't sue people. But I felt like he wouldn't stop, and his son as well. We won. They're appealing. But we won. I'm going to donate. If we win, I'm going to donate it to a women's association. I know it's the last resort. I just felt like, what else am I going to do? I showed all the evidence, and he wouldn't stop.
Just for the people who haven't heard you talk about this before, what was the basis of the first decision, which was in your favor? It was connected to reputational damage.
It was connected, two decisions. The one, the president's and his son's. His son, who's a legislator, said he had the legislative immunity. So he could go online and say that a reporter was offering sex. And the judge said that is not legislative immunity or freedom of speech or any anything like that. And the other thing is, they said, the other judge said, you are public figures, you have the responsibility of respecting and not damaging people's reputation just because you're in a position of authority. So this was a good decision.
It was a very good decision, and it was held up, as a beacon of hope that legal action might be one potential route, along with, other legislative responses. It's under appeal now. We don't know what will ultimately be the outcome. Yeah. But I think, again, this is a case for those of you looking at what legal responses could look like. Patricia's is a very important case study in the Brazilian context. Rana Ayyub is also taking action. I mentioned that she's based in Qatar. She works for Al Jazeera. She's taking action in a US court in Florida, and she's taking action against people who've been identified as, I have to be cautious about the way they express this, but identified in connection with foreign state actor-based harassment that she experiences online, and through investigative work, she's been able to identify US residents who've been involved in coordinated attacks against her. And some of the most significant online violence Rana experiences is connected to the Saudi state. So there are cases that are starting to build, and I might at some point come to you, Keelan, from the floor and just ask you, putting you on the spot here, but for your thoughts on legal avenues and what needs to shift there. Rana, I might throw the platform question at you, because you mentioned earlier, that you've referred many of these threats, some of them very serious, to the platforms. I actually have escalated a death threat against Rana, which I was tagged in as well, involving a GIF with a man holding guns, and it said bang bang, and it was clear that this was indeed a threat. That was on Twitter. I escalated it after I received a notice following 2 days of presumably consideration on Twitter's side. They came back to me with the standard, this does not breach our policies. And in fact, if you think that this tweet poses a risk to somebody, or you think that this tweet could instigate harassment against somebody, please come back to us. And this is a journalist sitting to my left who is one of the most prominent cases of gender-based online violence against a journalist internationally. And Twitter, let me tell you, is doing more than Facebook or any of the other platforms to date to try and actually address this, but that's where that's at. So I escalated it to a policy contact I have in Twitter. That person, who I won't name because they are trying to address this situation, is making a concerted effort, but that tweet is still online. So, I mean, in reference to that, Rana, can I just get you to just express your response to the platforms in the way that they have dealt with the complaints that you have put to them?
Before I speak about that, Julie, I think it's triggering and exhausting to listen to these conversations, whether it was Marianna, whether it is Patricia, that I think it feels like all dictators are playing from the same playbook. The experiences are so uncannily similar that it's like verbatim. So when Patricia was talking about it, it just triggered a whole range of emotions within me, because I know exactly what it is to be in that place. And in a country where I am in a patriarchal setup, when something like this goes viral, a porn video with your image morphed in it, when members of the ruling party accuse you of being sexually promiscuous. See, Twitter is, you can answer to people on Twitter, but the thing is, this is not just restricted to Twitter. We are living in a world of WhatsApp forwards and Facebook. So this screenshot goes viral all over, and your relatives forward this to you saying, oh, we heard this about you. How many people are you going to explain this about? People are forming an opinion about us. Patricia said she's filed a suit against the president, but there are people, whether it's Patricia, it's Marianna, whether it's me, they will form an opinion because they want to form an opinion about these women, because they hate us, and the only way they can find an outlet to this hate is to basically accuse us of being promiscuous women. about more than a month ago, one tweet from me on Yemen about the way Saudis were bombing Yemen led to at least 40,000 tweets from Saudis and Indian trolls. And it felt like it was so coordinated that everybody knew that people, some of the high-profile people in the Saudi, bureaucracy or people who are followers and nationalists there and nationalists in India, asking me to meet the same fate as Jamal Khashoggi, and why doesn't somebody kill her the same way Jamal Khashoggi was killed? And I would want to bring, as Julie rightly pointed out, the difference between online and offline. I spoke about her yesterday as well, but Gauri Lankesh, my journalist friend who was killed in 2017, there was a hate campaign against me on social media, and I wrote about it on my Facebook, and she replied saying, babe, there's something to the effect that, you're much stronger than this. And she called me and said, these are nincompoops, these are paper tigers, these are anonymous bots, I get them every day. And the next and she had translated my book, a self-published book, on the government in a regional language. And the next evening, she was shot dead outside her house in Bangalore. And till today, nobody has been arrested. None of them. And there were people celebrating her death on Twitter openly, including people who were members of this government who were celebrating Gauri Lankesh's death. And when I flagged this, and I have flagged this to social media platforms, I don't know how many times I've been on platforms and panels with them. The problem with social media organizations is they do not believe there is a problem. You will solve a problem when you acknowledge a problem. You think social media, online hate is not a problem. When I went to the cops with all the death threats and rape threats against me, with the porn video and the way I was doxxed and I got burnt copies of my book at my residence, they said, but ma'am, what happened? And I said, I'm being solicited for sex by random people. She said, yeah, but what is the problem? And I kept trying to, and there were like male cops, and they were watching the video, and they were sniggering, and they were laughing, and they're smiling. And you got a woman, and I am a woman of somebody who is widely known. I shudder to think what would happen to a woman who does not have my profile when she goes to the cops in a patriarchal setup. What would her parents do? Ask her to take a step back. Just stop reporting. So and that's what many journalists do. It is effective. Yeah. Unfortunately, I want to say this before I give it back. Like I was thinking about this morning, that earlier when I used to give a lecture, or if everybody appreciated it, I'd feel very good about it. I'd feel loved. But now I feel scared because the next day I know there's going to be a Twitter campaign to shame me for what I spoke the previous day. So what they're doing is literally shaming us into silence.
Yeah, well, they're trying, and yet you fought in court and won to be here, but you're still going to deal with this, this torrent of threats and abuse that comes at you. And as I said before, we see it in the data. It's within a second or two that the torrent begins, but it doesn't stop after a day. It continues to build.
I once put a full stop on Twitter, like a tweet with just one full stop, there were 1,000 replies. So for people who say, oh, don't tweet and go low profile, honestly, it doesn't matter.
And these are not, according to our reading so far, these are not what we used to refer to as bots. They're not fake accounts that are automated and computer-driven. These are, these are Hindu nationalists. They're orchestrated in the sense of demonstrating the kinds of markers that we might attribute to dark PR campaigns, where you're talking about troll farms, for example. So if I can get you, Patricia, to talk about your experiences of trying to deal with the platforms and what you think needs to change. And so much needs to change, I know, but if you can indicate from your perspective what would be a good start from the platforms, that would be helpful.
Well, a good start would be to acknowledge this is a problem. I mean, in the beginning, in 2018, when we started reporting about this, first they said there's no automation, there's no bots. Then they realized, and I do agree with Julie, I mean, most of it is like real people, because sometimes you say, who the hell writes that? Is that a real person writing this? Yes, there's real people who think that and write that. So then in the beginning when I was reporting and they were saying, oh, freedom of expression. And I'm saying, this is not freedom of expression. It's like someone saying he's going to rape me. So after a few years, I think that the whole, at least in Brazil, there's a the network of women journalists and non-journalists was really strong when these attacks started. So there was a huge pressure on platforms, and that is the only language they understand, right? PR.
Yeah.
So after...
Also, the falling of share prices has a little dent.
Yes.
Yeah.
So after this PR nightmare, they started being more proactive. But again, I'll give you an example. Twitter is being proactive in Brazil in terms of, okay, so there's a problem, we're going to deal with it. But there's no transparency. We don't know how many people do you have moderating contents in Portuguese. Do you have any, like how many Portuguese speakers or Hindi speakers or whatever, right? How much do you invest in AI? You know, saying you're doing stuff. It costs money.
Yeah. Marianna, if we can bring Marianna back up on the screen now, you also examined the failures of the platforms in response to your own experiences, and one of the things you did with Panorama that I thought was really novel was to create a kind of archetype character who I think you named Barry, and Barry's experience of being referred on to deeper and darker misogynistic content. Can you put some layers on that, that anecdote for us and explain what happened and what you think it indicates about what needs to change? She's muted. I think you're muted.
Hello, can you hear
There
me
you
now?
are. We just saw it was like you're in Italy, so the hands made.
Yeah, exactly. So as part of the Panorama investigation, we created this dummy account called Barry, and Barry, who was effectively me, was based on the accounts that said me hate. So he was predominantly interested in anti-vax and COVID conspiracy content, but also a little bit of misogyny, because we had to indicate to the platforms that this was a troll account, but very, very low level kind of hate and everything else, mainly conspiracy stuff and just other interests, you know, cars and holidays and cats and stuff like that. And we made a profile across the different main social media platforms, so Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and TikTok. And what we found over the course of 2 weeks of just going on, engaging minimally, and then logging off, was that particularly on both Facebook and Instagram, Barry was very quickly pushed towards much more extreme anti-women content, particularly linked to the incel movement. And some of the stuff was absolutely awful. I mean, some of the content on Instagram in particular, some of the incel pages, actually many incel pages link from all over the world, including in India, predominantly from India, but also in a variety of different places. You know, the social media sites came back to us and said, we do prioritize user safety over profit, and we don't allow hate on our platforms, but all of the evidence from our experiment suggests otherwise. Obviously, that's only one account, but we very much set it up to be similar to an account that would be sending out hate, or that would be, you know, susceptible to engaging in this kind of trolling. And I think what's important is not just, you know, the risk that poses to women, that people who are inclined to send hate to them are being effectively radicalized into a world of more extreme misogyny incredibly quickly as a consequence of the algorithms on these sites. But also, those people themselves are in many ways victims of the social media sites and the algorithms. And whilst obviously they have, you know, responsibility for their own behavior, it does teach you about how this works. And I mean, even as part of the Panorama, it struck me, Patricia, when you were saying, you know, who sits down and writes this stuff? And there was a guy I called who lives in Birmingham in the UK, and I said to him, he sent me hate and he agreed to speak to me. And I said to him, well, why do you send me this stuff? And he started saying, well, people send me hate because I think 9/11 isn't real. Like, it's not
quite the same. But that's
but it just, like you say, it shows, you know, it gave some insight into, and since then, since I spoke to him, he's never sent me any more hate. He occasionally sends me links to videos on YouTube, but I've become a real person to him in a way that seemingly I wasn't before.
And early on, you know, there was experimentation by women, you know, before the social media platforms were so heavily populated and where the abuse was really viral. I know journalists who did investigations where they called up their trolls, just as Marianna did, the human ones, and they stopped because it was like, when I sent that, I wasn't really thinking of you as a person. I mean, this is part of the problem, but there is absolutely no possible way anymore that approach would work on respond at scale. But what Marianna points to there is something that, that I refer to as algorithmic abuse, you know, and there's a lot of debate we don't have time to get into, not least because our session is essentially over, but around regulation and the complications of trying to regulate content, so pulling down abusive and harassing and threatening posts versus legislating to address, you know, the algorithmic abuse that takes the form of referrals to hate-based content and the amplification of hate-based content. So a combination of those responses. We have very little time in the seconds left, but I would like to be able to show the dashboard that I've got on the screen here, which is something that Dianna and her team have laboured over. Dianna, if you could perhaps just talk for 1 or 2 minutes about, and if you could take Rana's microphone to do that, 1 or 2 minutes about what we're doing collaboratively here to try to develop tools that can monitor journalists' experiences of online violence, including the women sitting here, to highlight where there are threats and risks of significant escalation that we could be able to develop into a tool that could construe an early warning system. So the dashboard that we have on the screen behind us, Di, just talk to us about what it's designed to do.
Yeah, so essentially for these big data case studies, of which Rana is one of our cases, we've been collecting tweets. We've been by Rana and by all the people who reply to Rana and all the people who mention her in tweets. So we've had a collection running for Rana for over 2 years. And from that, we've created tools that automatically analyze the text. They find where the tweets are abusive, and specifically where they're abusive towards Rana. We also characterize the type of abuse. So, for example, whether it's misogynistic, whether it's racist, whether it's political, and so on, and various other features such as what they're talking about and so on. And then we've produced, from all that data, we've produced a dashboard, which is still in development actually at the moment. What you're seeing is just showing the last month from February. So this is February 2022 that's being displayed at the moment. And from this you can try to understand some statistics about what's going on, so how much abuse there is, what type of abuse, what hashtags are being shown, what's trending, and so on. You can see things like how long does it take before someone sends an abusive tweet. So we can see tweets coming in within 2 seconds of people tweeting. We've got graphs that show, for example, the vast majority of tweets in Rana's case were within 3 minutes of her tweeting. We can delve into who's sending the abuse, so we can look into the people sending it. We can see the whole conversation around it. We can look into their profiles as well and understand that. We also have network analysis that's showing people that tries to indicate, for example, orchestrated abuse, where we see networks of people who tweet the same things, who tweet the same abusive replies, and so on. And so we can start to delve with a combination of automated tools and a sort of manual deep dive. We can delve into what's going on and try and understand the picture. And this is leading us to try and understand better where the problems arise, and a much bigger picture than just looking at the tweets themselves. But it's quite...
Thanks.
Yes.
Thanks very much, Di. I mean, we have no time, of course, to go into this in detail. This is very much a work in progress. It's part of the project that we're producing for, it's funded by the UK Foreign Office, which we hope will evolve into the development of an early warning system that includes digital tools, that also includes pathways for escalation to the platforms. Wish us luck with attempting to get them to engage with the process through UN processes as well, and through engagement with industry and civil society organisations. So watch that space, and we will be following up with various people present at the festival to seek their input on what we're doing so far. But this is all to say, this last piece, that we are trying to respond effectively and proactively to these horrendous experiences across a range of approaches. I just want to give Marianna and Patricia and Rana the opportunity to say one more sentence, if you would like. If you don't want to, that is completely fine with me. I think Rana's going to pass that on by. Patricia, would you like to say something?
Yes. I actually just wanted to say something I said this morning. It's still the best job in the world, so don't let that intimidate us, all of us. It's the only thing I have to say.
Yeah. That's the solidarity that we need to help women like these and many in the audience, no doubt, stand up to that intimidation. But we need help to do that collectively. Marianna, did you want to say one last thing?
I was actually going to say exactly the same thing.
Perfect.
Which is, don't let it, that's what it's designed to do. So, anyone listening, don't be put off. Please keep doing the reporting and the journalism you're doing. And it feels so positive, although it's difficult to sit here and everyone be talking about it. And just you listening means a lot. So thank you.
Thank you. And please give them a round of applause. And in fact, I'm going to stand as well. Thank you, everybody. So I think we certainly stand with Rana, and we need to be by her side as she flies back to India, everybody. Thank you. Thanks very much. Okay, you want to sit now?